Spurs have missed the playoffs twice in a row with only a few young guys to give this team hope for the future, as Popovich seems to waste away the remaining years of his coaching prowess with a mediocre team that he assembled.
As a lifelong San Antonio Spurs fan, Gregg Popovich is not only my favorite coach of all time, but I believe is the greatest of all time as well. Recently, one of my favorite basketball analysts, Rusty Buckets, made a deep dive into the dark side of Popovich's legacy, and it was excellent. So if you haven't already, go ahead and watch it, because a lot of this video will be responsive to some of the main points he made. Just make sure to come back here once he finished it. If you take a look at Popovich's career as a coach, you'll see 5 championships, 6 Western Conference wins, 13 division titles, and 19 years of at least 50 wins. Under Pop's leadership, the Spurs went from a small market team with no future to now one of the most winning franchises not only in NBA history, but sports history. Rusty even admits as much himself that Pop is the greatest coach of all time in his analysis.
And it was this series that, for me and for many other people, cemented Gregg Popovich as the greatest coach of all time. Yeah, as much slander as this video is going to have for Popovich, I still think he's the greatest coach of all time.
But titles only go so far in describing Pop's historic dynasty in San Antonio. There is so much more lying underneath the surface. Popovich started out his career with probably the most lucky circumstance a new head coach could possibly ask for. His franchise player was out with injury, and he was about to draft the undisputable best power forward of all time in Tim Duncan. In their first season, the Spurs turned their 20-62 record around to 56 wins, almost 3 times as many victories. Some may credit this to Pop, and while he should certainly get some of the credit, this was mostly to David Robinson being healthy once again, and with Rookie of the Year Tim Duncan absolutely tearing things up in the league. The Spurs' greatness would only be cemented the next season, as they finished top of the Western Conference and swept the Knicks in 5 games, and their greatness would continue as they win another title in 03, and then another in 05, and another in 07. Oh yeah, and one last one in 2014. But who was it that truly won these titles for San Antonio? Was it Popovich's excellent coaching, or was it Tim Duncan's greatness and leadership on the court? The easy and correct answer is both, but who deserves more credit? As great as Pop is, I think Duncan certainly deserves the bulk of the credit. His greatness extended much further than just his abilities. Tim Duncan's humility established a culture in San Antonio that extended to every player that came in through the draft or they picked up in free agency. StatJack summarized it best with this statement. I couldn't find the exact clip, but in so many words he said, how could he or anyone else dare question Popovich if Tim Duncan could sit there and be berated for 5 minutes for not rebounding the basketball right? When it comes to sports, and honestly any profession, there is nothing more influential than greatness. Tim Duncan was great. Gregg Popovich was great. And you cannot deny the success that these two had together. So if Duncan wouldn't question Pop, then why would anyone else? Rusty called this characteristic of Popovich an inflated ego. It's a fair criticism, and I think Rusty does a good job backing his point up. However, is it really an inflated ego if Pop is actually that good? If I had to compare Popovich's career to anyone else in the NBA, it would definitely be Michael Jordan. They both had long periods of greatness where they established themselves as the GOAT, while they also had extreme luck at getting building pieces around them to keep their winningness alive. And when their luck ran out, they fell from greatness, still grasping at the aspects that made them great in the past, that just don't work out in current times. You cannot ignore the luck that Popovich had, much like you can't ignore the luck that MJ had. They'd grown accustomed to being at the top, and when their time on top was over, they couldn't adjust. In 2011, the Spurs traded a rising prospect in George Hill for a defensive-minded, somewhat awkward Kawhi Leonard. At the time, I was highly pissed, as George Hill was a fantastic role player off the bench for us, and he was really lighting it up. I'd even gotten his signature at an academy in San Antonio, and he was my favorite player to use in 2K, so I was instantly soured to Kawhi at first, no matter his potential. However, it didn't take me long to be proven wrong, as Kawhi came in and instantly was a huge presence for San Antonio defensively. He still had some work to do offensively, but with his massive hands and arms that extended for days, he could just about defend anyone on the wing. It It wasn't long after that Kawhi was showing promise of being a future superstar, and in 2014 he proved his worth in the NBA Finals against the Miami Heat by defending LeBron while also averaging 18 points a game. He was destined for greatness, and was the next step in the Spurs process as Tim Duncan was getting ready to retire. After becoming the face of the franchise, and continuing on Timmy's legacy, it got cut short because of the scummiest player in NBA history, who won't even acknowledge my name. What happened next absolutely destroyed the Spurs, and tarnished Pop's legacy in a way that no one thought possible. I don't want to go into it too much as Rusty covered the situation pretty well in his video, but in summary, the Spurs training staff cleared Kawhi to play, but Kawhi didn't feel ready and wanted an outside opinion. Players and staff were publicly pressuring him to come back, and eventually Kawhi had enough and requested a trade. He got thrown out to the cold winters of Toronto, and emerged an NBA champion, while the Spurs had their first season in 2 decades below 50 wins. It was humiliating. It was made even worse when Kawhi was signed to the Clippers, getting what he wanted in the end after all. The Spurs have never looked the same since, and this left a sour taste in everyone's mouth about Pop. It exposed how his arrogance could have drastic consequences, and it showed that Popovich had his flaws. I used to hate Kawhi for this, but now I understand where he was coming from. This was 100% on Popovich for how he and the rest of the Spurs organization handled the situation. But why was I so quick to hate on Kawhi? In fact, the whole world seemed to. Even people who weren't Spurs fans.
Isn't it amazing, too, that when you think about the tradition of the Spurs, Tim Duncan, David Robinson, Manu Ginobili, stability, Tony Parker, all we ever talked about was, would they play another year? Will you stick around? Here's a guy in the prime of his career. He doesn't want, they could give him 5 years, $219 million. He's going to lose out on it.
Whoever's in this kid's ear, we've heard that it's an uncle. This seems to be irresponsibly dumb.
Yeah, I think so,
to me. From the outside looking in.
It's your organization.
You're the face of the most stable franchise in the NBA over the last 15 years. What the hell are you doing?
Because basically what he said is, look, damn it, the Riverwalk and everything that comes with it don't excite me no more. I want out. And that's what's home for them. And he departed from there. And by the way, departed while provoking people to ask questions about the Spurs as an organization because of how presumably they supposedly mishandled his whole injury.
It'd be easy to say it was out of ignorance, but in reality, it was due to an understanding of how fantastic the Spurs organization has always been. And screwing a player over like this would be completely out of character. Between when Pop was made head coach and when Kawhi got traded for Toronto, the Spurs had a blemishless track record. They did not make a single mistake in those 20 straight years, other than maybe this one mistake. But that was taken care of the next season. Popovich's talent as a coach relied on his ability to maximize potential, and we'll get there in a minute. What we're going to focus on right now is Popovich's care when it came to veterans. It's the norm nowadays for NBA teams to rest their top players often during the regular season, especially the older ones. But that wasn't always the case. Popovich is the first coach to do this regularly, and he was massively criticized for it. I remember a particular game back in 2012 when the Spurs faced off against last year's champions, the Miami Heat. This was expected to be a big matchup, as both teams were contenders, and would eventually face each other in the NBA Finals in the next 2 seasons. However, as the Spurs stars ran onto the court, something wasn't quite right. Duncan wasn't there, Parker wasn't there, and neither were Ginobili or Danny Green. Their starting lineup consisted of Patty Mills, Nando De Colo, Boris Diaw, Matt Bonner, and Tiago Splitter. Fans were outraged. They came to see 2 title contenders face off, and all they were getting was Nando De Colo? Despite their questionable lineup, the Spurs played a fantastic game, and were up by 3 going into the 4th quarter. They ended up losing the game by 5, but you had to hand to not only the Spurs role players, but Gregg Popovich's coaching to hold on. The Spurs were fined $250,000 the next day for the violation of a league policy reviewed with the NBA Board of Governors in April 2010 against resting players in a manner contrary to the best interest of the NBA. And David Stern would later call this an unacceptable decision by the San Antonio Spurs. Popovich didn't care, however, and neither did I. We still ended up having a fantastic game, and got to see our role players in a role we don't normally get to see them in. It was this game that Gary Neal proved himself to be a fantastic role player for us, and he would later go on to score 24 points against the Heat in the NBA Finals that year in a Game 3 blowout. And that won't even be the last time that Pop got fined for resting his big three. Over the next few years, whenever any of them needed a breather, he gave it to them. This not only gave them a chance to rest, but also for younger talents to shine. This was the bread and butter of the Spurs system. The Spurs were known for taking care of their star players, and making sure not to play them unless they were rested and ready. This was their legacy, and that is why when Kawhi was cleared to play, we all immediately trusted them. After all, when have they ever made a mistake in the past? Of course, this is ignorant for us to think, as at the end of the day, if Kawhi wasn't ready, he wasn't ready, and we should have respected that decision. But you can't help but admit that it was all very sketchy, especially with Kawhi's lack of transparency not only with the media, but with the Spurs organization, and of course the elusive Uncle Dennis. After all, if it wasn't for San Antonio, would Kawhi ever have become the superstar he is today? Potentially, but the team that he was drafted by, Indiana, already had a defensive-minded elite wing in Paul George, so what role would Kawhi really serve for him? Gregg Popovich and the Spurs did everything in their power to cultivate Kawhi's talents, and gave him a future and a chance to prove himself to be one of the top 5 players in the league. I don't say this as an attempt to accuse Kawhi of anything. I'm just explaining how it came across to Spurs fans when he requested a trade. He cut us deep, and it cut Pop even deeper. Everything he did was to foster Kawhi's future in San Antonio, and I still believe to this day that if Kawhi never left, we would have won at least 2 more championships with him. But at the end of the day, things escalated in a way they didn't need to, and I can now say I don't blame Kawhi for leaving. Let's now talk about Pop's eye for potential. Gregg Popovich certainly lucked out by having Duncan as a cornerstone, but his success was contingent on a lot more than that. After all, there are very few players who can win a championship on their own. It takes a full team around them. Their first title was about as close as you can get to one superstar dominating on his own, that being Tim Duncan, but there were definitely instrumental pieces around him that served their roles perfectly. David Robinson was the most notable co-star, but he was already getting quite old. But if you take a look at the other players on the Spurs team, you'll notice an unbelievable pattern. Avery Johnson, undrafted. Sean Elliott, 3rd overall, left San Antonio but came back in his older age. Mario Elie, 160th overall pick. Jaren Jackson, undrafted. Malik Rose, 44th overall pick. Steve Kerr, 50th overall pick. This team was filled with underutilized players that when put in the Spurs system, maximized their potential and reached heights they could never imagine. But this team still had 2 first overall picks as the frontrunners. Once in a generation talents, right? Well, let's take a look at their next championship team. 2003, the Spurs again win the NBA Finals, this time against the New Jersey Nets as Duncan has another dominant performance and wins Finals MVP. But who is his supporting cast? Tony Parker, 28th overall pick. Stephen Jackson, 42nd overall pick. Bruce Bowen, undrafted. Manu Ginobili, 57th overall pick. And lastly, an aging David Robinson and of course Malik Rose. But again, this is just Duncan in his absolute prime. So what about 2005? Timmy D was of course Finals MVP, but he had to rely much more on his team around him against the reigning champions in Detroit in a 7-game series. Again, we had a homegrown Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili, as well as Bruce Bowen, who had made a name for himself with the Spurs. After that, the only other real contributors were Robert Horry and Brent Barry, who were both out of their prime but still played great basketball, and only averaged around 20 minutes a game. So let's look at 2007, the first year that Tim Duncan didn't win a Finals MVP. This year it was Tony Parker who took over, as the Cavaliers had no answer for him. The core is roughly the same as before, with Manu, Duncan, Bruce Bowen, Robert Horry, and Brent Barry all coming back. The only other contributors were 33-year-old Michael Finley and Fabrizio Alberto, who of course was undrafted. And then, in their latest Finals victory, a new rising star in Kawhi Leonard took home the Finals MVP trophy as a 15th overall pick, and someone who was never expected to reach the heights that he has now. He was surrounded by, of course, the Spurs' big three, as well as a 31-year-old past his prime Boris Diaw, Danny Green, who was undrafted, Tiago Splitter, who was the 28th overall pick, and Patty Mills, who was the 55th overall pick. These players were never expected to succeed, let alone play in the NBA, and yet year after year, without fail, the Spurs molded these rough talents into championship-caliber players. Here's a list of every player that was on the Spurs from 1998 to now. I'll leave a link in the description below. If you can find me even one player whose talents weren't maximized in San Antonio, I'll give you a shout in the next video, because it is amazing to look at. The closest examples I could find outside of Kawhi were Steve Novak, who didn't do much in San Antonio, but ended up being a pretty decent three-point shooter for New York, and Kyle Anderson, who was underutilized in San Antonio due to the overwhelming amount of talent, and he's now a pretty great player for the Grizzlies. But if your two biggest missed opportunities as a franchise are Kyle Anderson and Steve Novak, I think you're doing a pretty good job. Some other players I didn't even get to mention because they weren't on championship teams were Matt Bonner, the 45th overall pick, who was a lights-out three-point shooting big man who played some key moments for us in multiple finals and playoffs. Gary Neal, who was undrafted. He was another fantastic shooter who never did much outside of San Antonio, but during his time with us was a great role player off the bench. Aaron Baines, undrafted. He didn't do much in his first few years, but he was an important role player off the bench in 2014. Marco Bellinelli, who was drafted 18th overall, but had some of his best years in San Antonio. And of course, how can I make this list without including Jonathan Simmons, who got his payday with the Magic after tearing it up in San Antonio, and never did anything afterwards. There has never been a team in sports history who has found so many diamonds in the rough, who has given chances to players from all over the world to come to the NBA and show their talents. The way Rusty phrased it,
but the reason he feels this way and the reason he likes those types of players is because the less entitled ones are a lot easier to control.
And that may sound like a bad thing, but when you have a master potter like Pop, you can't complain with the results. In the NBA, there is nothing that players respect more than greatness. Michael Jordan was great, and he attracted other great players to form around him and follow his every word. LeBron James was and is great, and his teammates have learned to come around to the fact that if they want to succeed, they have to follow his lead. In the same way, Gregg Popovich is oozing with greatness, and what he says goes. You do not question greatness, and you don't fight it. You simply follow what Pop tells you to do, and if you do, you'll succeed. He's one of the last coaches that has that kind of power, and it is deserved in every way imaginable. In 2021 more than ever, we've grown to mistrust those who are in power, and to always question authority. I think these are fantastic traits to have, and should be encouraged, especially with how horrible the vast majority of companies treat their employees. However, if your company is treating you well, paying you what you're worth, giving you every opportunity to succeed and reach your limits, why would you mistrust your boss? The issue right now with Popovich is that he was not built to lose. He was built to win. And until we get another superstar for him to build around, we're going to be stuck in limbo, because Pop is not capable of tanking. That isn't part of his DNA, and I can only imagine how much these past 3 years have been killing him internally. Is it time for the Spurs to move on to a different coach? I mean, maybe, but until he retires or passes away, I wouldn't want anyone else to lead our team year in and year out. After all, this is the first time in 2 decades that the Spurs are getting a lottery pick, and the NBA may not be ready for Popovich having such a high pick again. Thank you for taking the time to watch me gush over my favorite coach and favorite team. This video ended up being a lot longer than I originally thought. If you want to see more videos like this, let me know in the comments. There's a whole lot more where this came from. I also have a series out where I'm reassembling the NBA from the 09-10 season to the present day with a custom roster I built myself. It has every single player with an original face customization, accurate ages, jersey number, salary and position, and all their ratings are based off 2K10. I spent over 2 months perfecting it, so just know this is the best roster that 2K could possibly allow for. I've already published the first 5 years that are available on my channel, so please go check them out and show them some love. Also, go show some love to Rusty Buckets as well, as he was what inspired me to make this video in the first place, and subscribe to him if you haven't already. But that's going to do it for this video, so I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.